So there you go.
Perfect. And then we have one speaker joining
Remote.
via, yeah,
Yep.
so will I just ping her?
Oh, you can, absolutely.
Okay, great.
If you want, you can pause the recording right now.
600,000 people have entered Moldova for a population of 2.5 million. But very good.
There wouldn't be much reason. If you have the opportunity to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's always nice to hear. I've had, that's really nice to hear. It's funny because we just had a person that left our associate director of our US program. Just left actually.
I don't know how
And for the Sonic part, she was saying that really he was a one student like that I had sometimes hired her to go into the almost embarrassed. I know that this was a colleague. I had no, I had just like no glimmer of an idea that I had never met her even prior. Well, lengthy. I can definitely agree on that. That's no question on that.
Thank you. Whenever I think of first year long-term he is like we've already been.
Oh, dude, you have to indicate.
I know, it's funny, like we just all in on them.
Yeah.
That's when
I know.
Here or something.
Yeah. So you guys are.
Good afternoon. Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Well, first of all, welcome. It's so wonderful to have you at this event. I want to welcome our in-person audience, but I also want to welcome our Zoom connected audience. It's absolutely fantastic that now, especially that we're entering an academic phase, we can actually do hybrid events, which is actually something fairly new for the law school, but it's a wonderful way to be able to communicate. So I thank you so much for being here. And as you have seen, we're going to be covering a lot of the impact, legal issues, and implications of the refugee crisis that we're having derived from the Russia and Ukraine conflict, which is a very serious issue. And I have to say, I feel very, very lucky today because I'm surrounded by some of the best experts in the area in the world, right? So it's really important to start, I think, this event with a note of gratitude for our speakers. I always tell people, that September is the busiest time of the year for any professional, especially professionals working in the area of international law and human rights. So we're incredibly grateful that all of you, are able to be here with us today. And I also want to start by thanking in a very big way, Professor Leah Calabro. She worked incredibly hard to make sure And this event took place, and it's also one of our first hybrid events, right? And I always tell students and everybody at the law school that hybrid events are particularly challenging to put on. You're connecting people in person, you're connecting people virtually. So it's absolutely fantastic, that we have Leah, to help us with this as well. And I actually want to introduce thank you so much. Tracy always saves us, by the way. Tracy Emerson, just for those of you that don't know her, she's our international and foreign law librarian. She's actually a part of the International and Comparative Law program. So thank you so much. And I also wanted to introduce myself because some of you may not know me or may know me from the law school. My name is Rosa Lawyer. I actually serve as Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies at this law school. That means that I direct International and Comparative Law program, and this is an event hosted by the International and Comparative Law program. More importantly, I actually want to introduce our speakers because we have these wonderful speakers today, and I'm actually introducing them in alphabetical order by last name. They're all wonderful, so it's difficult to figure out the order in which to introduce them. So I'm doing my best, right? We have Alice Farmer, right? Who is a Senior Protection Officer for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees based out of Moldova. And she previously served as legal officer for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Washington, D.C. office. And before that, as protection officer in the Washington office. And prior to joining the Washington office, she worked on refugee and human rights issues in various capacities for major organizations, actually for Human Rights Watch, the American Civil Liberties Union, and also the Norwegian Refugee Council. And next to me, I also have Lisha Miendo, right? She's Human Rights First inaugural Chief Legal Officer. She's responsible for overseeing the full spectrum of legal matters for the organization, including risk and compliance programs, advancement of high impact litigation, and also litigation that addresses many social issues and legal representation of refugees and asylum seekers. It's absolutely wonderful to have her here too, because we have a lot of students that do internships in Human Rights First as well. Okay? And we also have Bill Frelick, and it's difficult to introduce Bill Frelick because he's really a legend in this area, right? Many of us have actually worked with him in the past, and he continues doing work in this area. He has served as the Refugee Rights Director at Human Rights Watch since 2005. And through his work, he monitors, investigates, and documents human rights abuses against refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons, and advocates for the rights of forcibly displaced persons worldwide. And we also have, of course, Olena Mikhalchenko, who's actually connected online. She's actually connected from the Ukraine, just so that you know. And Olena, we're so proud to call her our alum. She's an LLM graduate of this program with an international and comparative law degree. She's currently working at the World Bank's group with Women, Business, and Law Project. She's also from the Ukraine, so she has been very personally affected by the situation as well as her family members. And we're incredibly proud to call her our graduate. It's wonderful to see her connected today. And I also want to introduce Leah Calabro because she's going to be a commentator today as well. And Leah is also a graduate of our program. She graduated with a JD concentration in international and comparative law with honors, may I add. She was a great student at the law school. During her time at GW Law, she was the Thurgood Marshall Scholar, an executive articles editor for the George Washington International Law Review, and a member of our Jessup International Law Network. And she also was a recipient of the Judge Oliver Grenadier Award. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors. We have a lot of co-sponsors today. I actually want to first thank, the International Refugee Law Interest Group of the American Society of International Law, the Washington Foreign Law Society, and our own International Law Society as well. And I just wanted to give some very brief remarks before I actually ask a few questions to our panelists. And I first want to begin by recognizing the alarming nature of the issue that we're discussing today and what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment. It is a mixture of alarm, of horror, of outrage, tragedy, and a formidable human suffering. I've been discussing, you know, this issue with our faculty and our students since the war started. And what's amazing is that we're just transitioning from a world in which we were dominated by this major pandemic, and we still are in some ways, turning into an endemic, hopefully. And suddenly we're in a world that's dominated by war on TV. It's not that we never had war, we always have had war, right? But this one is very, very visible to the media, to the global community. So very interesting to see that shift, you know, between a world dominated by a pandemic and suddenly we're very, very fixated in this war. We're very concerned about this war. And one of the reasons why this conflict is so concerning is because it has far-reaching international effects and impacts that we're going to be discussing today. This is a huge international law crisis, especially for those of you that are studying international comparative law. It's important to frame what's happening in the Ukraine also within the realm of international law, with many international law implications, including refugee law, humanitarian law, human rights, criminal law, and economic law components, among others. And I think also, I always tell our students that it's very important to grasp the human whole, the human whole of the issues that we're discussing in this law school. Conflicts have and produce a great deal of suffering. We have millions of refugees and so many displaced persons, you know, basically connected with this conflict, that basically a lot of Ukrainians desperate to leave for safety, and we will be discussing that today. But I think it's also important to discuss also the strength of the Ukrainian people, right? We're witnessing something quite extraordinary. We're witnessing a resistance with grit, with defiance, with determination, and resilience in many ways. They're fighting for their self-determination, which is a critical right in international law as well. And from our program, I think it's very important also to send a message of support and solidarity to all of those affected by this crisis, including our students and alums as well. And I just wanted to close this first section just by saying that usually when we refer to refugees, because that's the main focus of our discussion today, we're referring to persons outside of their territories or countries of origin, basically countries of origin, who are often in need of international protection because of serious threats to their lives, physical integrity, and freedoms in their countries of origin due to armed conflicts, persecution, violence, and other forms of serious unrest. There is an entire body of international law that's actually dedicated or governs state obligations when it comes to the protection of refugees. But there's also all these other areas of international law that apply to what's happening to refugees, and especially the refugees in this particular situation. And it's important to keep those in mind as we're navigating the discussion today. And it's very important also to understand when you think of refugees, that they're rights holders, okay? They have the right to work, to access education, health and sufficient levels of food and water, mobility, housing, basically due process and status determination procedures, access to justice, and this right to live free from discrimination and violence. And I think also an intersectional lens in this kind of situation is very important. We are seeing in this situation many women refugees, many children refugees, many persons with disabilities, persons of African descent. You know, it's very important also to keep that lens and that focus when we're analyzing this situation. Again, thank you to our speakers for being here today. Thank you all for being here today. And I actually have some questions for our panelists. I actually want to start with Alice. This is okay with Alice? Of course. So I wanted to ask you, what is it about the Ukrainian refugee crisis, this crisis in particular, that makes the situation so serious, that it's commanding so much international attention? And you have extensive experience. So what are you finding basically to be among the biggest concerns for Ukrainian refugees?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for putting this panel together, and thank you for having us. Why is the Ukrainian crisis so serious? I think there's a really valid and open debate to be had as to whether it's more serious than many other refugee crises, but it is certainly one that has captured our attention. And one of the reasons, I think, is because of the rapidity with which people poured out of Ukraine, starting at the end of February and into March. So I work for UNHCR, the global UN refugee agency. And for the last year or so, I've been serving on a roster for emergency deployment. So when war broke out, I got orders to travel the next day, and 3 days later was in Moldova, helping set up the response with a number of other colleagues who had come in to do the same thing. We were initially, prior to the war, we had 1 person on the ground in Chisinau, and within about 6 weeks, we had 105 people there. And that was in order to meet the really remarkable numbers of people who have fled Ukraine. We have seen 12 million people leave Ukraine since the war began. And the bulk of them left in the first couple months. There has been some return back to Ukraine, but we are generally seeing that that is not a long-term return, that people are going back to get summer clothes, to see relatives. But in general, there's a lot of what we would call circular movement. So I think it's the severity and the rapidity of the crisis that helped capture people's attention. I can put that in context, perhaps, in Moldova, which is a tiny little country right on the western border of Ukraine. And it's the only one of the frontline countries to the west of Ukraine that is not part of the European Union. So the response to refugees there needed to be perhaps even strengthened further because we didn't have as much help immediately from the EU to do that. In Moldova, there are about 2.5 million people who live there. And now they've seen 600,000 people come through. So that is a really, that's adding a fifth to your population within 6 months. Except that actually a lot of people have moved through Moldova. So perhaps this is a good segue into some of the characteristics of this refugee crisis that I think are a little bit unusual compared to other things that we've worked in. So for instance, I have never in my life before worked in a country with open borders on both sides of that country. It's sort of unthinkable. Like we had the border between Moldova and Ukraine was open, people could cross, people could register easily at the crossing points. The border between Moldova and Romania was open, people could cross, people could easily move through. When borders are not as freely open, we see a lot of irregular migration and it can be much harder to track numbers. What was fascinating to me about working in this scenario in Moldova is we pretty much knew who was there. The Moldovans registered them on the way in, the Romanians registered them on the way out. We kind of knew who was there. So our numbers were pretty good. Like that's not necessarily typical for a lot of other places I've worked. So that very high rate of onward movement is also very unusual. We were looking at about a 75% onward movement rate from Moldova. And particularly that early in a refugee crisis, that's a very unusual thing. But if you think about the political setting when the European Union still had their borders so open, and the ease with which you can go between Moldova and Romania, Romania is the first EU country they will reach, you can see that onward movement would happen. That changed how UNHCR was thinking about our obligation to protect the human rights of refugees. It meant our programming changed. What are some of the concerns we see going forward? First, I should say that I very recently left Moldova and left my emergency placement and transited back over to someone who'll now be there permanently in that position. Although I told him he was there permanently and he gave me a panicked look. Some of the things we're concerned about as we look forward is winterization, that it's pretty hard to take care of refugees when it's cold. Shelter starts to matter a ton. You start to really think about how do you make sure people are not suffering some of the very basic shelter and health needs that come in cold weather. That's something that's happening in Moldova right now. It's a massive interagency effort to winterize the refugee response, but not just in Moldova, but throughout Poland, throughout a lot of the receiving countries. Also within Ukraine, where we're looking at there being, I think, about 7 million IDPs right now. That is a big worry. How do you take care of them in the winter? And that becomes, so in Moldova, we can plan. We can get tents in, we can get blankets in, we can figure out how to refurbish some government buildings so that they can be used as collective centers that can be heated. What's harder about that for winterizing for IDPs within Ukraine is you have to assume that the Russians will bomb in late November and take out a lot of the things that you would look at to be able to respond adequately to a winter population. So winterization is one of our problems looking forward. Second problem looking forward is there's a big amount of family separation. The Ukrainians have been holding back men between the ages of 18 and 60. There are a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, that has caused pretty widespread family separation. So when we're talking about the 7 million people who are currently outside of Ukraine, most of them will not be intact nuclear families because of the constraints on men leaving Ukraine. And then I think one of the third big concern I would look to is that in addition to that 7 million of 7 million Ukrainians who are currently somewhere in Europe or the United States, Canada, there are 2.5 million Ukrainians who are in the Russian Federation. And we as an international system that tries to cover their human rights, we have next to no visibility on what's happening with that population. And so that's a pretty big concern. I think any of my colleagues can elaborate on a number of those points, so I'll turn back to you.
Thank you so much. And I think, especially building on those factors, right, and those differentiating characteristics or unique characteristics of this particular situation, I have a question for Leisha. The question is, when you think of these factors in the situation in the Ukraine, has this revealed basically shortcomings, right, or new shortcomings in the global response to refugee crisis?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely, it has. Many of the shortcomings, those of us who've been working in this space knew about already, but it amplified the shortcomings that were already there. The taking care of refugees has always been an incredible challenge worldwide. There hasn't been traditionally a worldwide uniform response. You have various countries who are responding in different ways. Some countries have agreements, informal or formal, with each other, and there might be a collective response among a handful of countries. But when you have a refugee crisis as large as the Ukrainian crisis, you really need a coordinated worldwide or hemispheric response. And that's almost impossible because you have different politicians who have different political angles. You have different societies with different values. You have discrimination either in favor of Ukrainians or against Ukrainians. So you have all sorts of factors. So one of the shortcomings is just the absolute difficulty in having a uniform response. Another one that we saw, and kudos to the people of Poland for this, they really have opened their doors to welcoming the Ukrainian refugees who, particularly in the beginning, were just pouring into the country. They have a large border with Ukraine. So it was natural that that would happen. One of the challenges with that, though, is Poland proportionally was absorbing a lot of Ukrainians, whereas other countries in the West, Germany, which also did open their doors, UK, France, because they were located further geographically from Ukraine, were not absorbing as many. This creates a tremendous strain on countries like Poland. Alice talked about Moldova as well. It just creates an incredible strain on the social systems of a particular country to immediately absorb 1 million, 2 million new people. Some of those people, many of the people may not speak the local language. They're coming with families, with children. Those children need to be enrolled in school. They need housing. This new population needs housing. Where are you going to house them? You can't put people in makeshift camps and tents forever. They need to be in real structure. So you have to ask the citizenry to open their doors and their families to house refugees. It raises questions of how long will the particular country be welcoming to this refugee population. And because of the internal strains on the society, you may see fraying of support for refugees. And that these are really difficult things for any individual country to deal with. But simply due to geopolitical issues, the lack of, a huge block response worldwide or hemispheric wide has not been really attainable or achievable. So you also find that each country is providing different resources to the refugee population. So Poland has been, in general, very generous in providing resources to the Ukrainian refugees. But other countries, it can vary. And that always has been the case. And so, depending upon luck of the draw, if you're a refugee, if you end up in country A, you may get certain social services. But if you end up in country B, you may get 10 times more. So it's also, creates a strain between the countries because it can create natural tensions between the countries. And then just one of the last things I wanted to mention, which is really one of the biggest things, and I would be remiss not to mention this, is one of the shortcomings that was really amplified, that has been really amplified in the public consciousness with regard to this refugee crisis is discrimination that unfortunately has woven itself into how certain countries handle certain refugee populations. We were, those of us working in the space were absolutely gratified and continue to be gratified at an open door policy that many countries have had to Ukrainians, including the United States in many ways. President Biden has promised to admit at least 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. That's a drop in the bucket, obviously, compared to the total number, but the United States is, geographically located much further away than Ukraine. And you can imagine most Ukrainians want to stay local, want to stay nearby their own country in case they can return. So, but what you find is, as Alice has indicated, the refugee crisis has been an ongoing crisis since really the beginning of time. We have had a Syrian refugee crisis. We have an ongoing Afghanistan refugee crisis. We have a refugee crisis of Haitians right here, just a few miles south of Florida. The response to welcoming those refugees has been markedly different than the worldwide response to welcoming Ukrainians. And that dichotomy is very painful to watch. It's something that we all should focus on and really analyze why that is happening and what we can do to fix that going forward, because everyone deserves a safe place to live, a safe place to raise their family. If their own country cannot provide that, everyone deserves to be welcomed in some other country that can provide that for their family. But other refugees have incredible hurdles that they have to overcome just to enter into a third-party country and seek asylum or seek safety. Many times they're turned away at a border. Whereas with the Ukrainian crisis, what we saw, gratefully so, was open doors to other countries. And I think that should serve, if there's a way that we can use that as a model, that piece of it as a model going forward, to recognize that people would prefer to stay in their own country. No one's trying to just leave their own country. If you're born somewhere, if you're raising your family somewhere, if that's where your language is spoken, if that's where your culture is, if that's where you're practicing your religion, if that's where your ancient artifacts are, you want to stay there. The only reason you flee is because it is so untenable to remain in your own country. And that was recognized and has been recognized and continues to be recognized with the Ukrainian refugee crisis. It is not recognized with the crisis pertaining to other populations, particularly brown and Black populations, that also have a refugee crisis that is just as compelling, that is just as dramatic and tragic for those individuals suffering in that space. And so this the Ukrainian refugee crisis, it has shown, you know, in a lot of ways, the best of humanity in terms of particularly some of these Western countries opening their doors, opening their homes. I mean, people, New York is the population, which is where I live. New York is the population, the state in the United States that has welcomed the most Ukrainian refugees out of any of the other states in the US. We have actually a strong Ukrainian community in Brooklyn. And it's absolutely gratifying to see private citizens volunteering to sponsor strangers from half a world away. It is amazing. It's wonderful. It shows the best of humanity. But let's also extend that to other populations that are just as deserving, but for the reasons I have indicated, have not received the same attention.
Thank you so much. And I think you bring such an important point, right? A lot of when we're studying the Ukrainian refugee crisis, you know, it's very difficult not to compare this crisis to what we're seeing with other countries and in other settings. And I actually wanted to ask Bill about this because he's actually worked extensively, right, with basically on the situation with Afghanistan, the Syrian refugee crisis. So if you could give us like some of your insights, your experiences, and what you think needs to be done.
Sure, and I'm really building on everything that Alicia just said. So, you know, you're asking how this differs from other refugee situations, and the double standards, the disparities are just, you know, they just scream at those of us that have worked on refugee issues for decades and decades, and it's not to take anything away from the Ukrainians and the response of people opening their homes, you know, not having big refugee camps. I mean, Alice was talking about this, you know, sudden influx of people, and we had 750,000 Rohingya that were coming into Bangladesh in a matter of weeks in 2017, August 2017, and they're all stuck in the largest refugee camp in the world now, Kutupalong in Cox's Bazar. Whereas in the case of the Ukrainians, we're at the sprawling refugee camps. You know, the people have opened their homes. It's just an amazing response that President Biden, you know, announced, you know, 100,000, and we're not going to worry about, you know, how they get here, or, you know, it's like we'll make it work, you know, and it's like we look at that and we just sort of go, wow. I mean, we're not, you know, we have Title 42 and remain in Mexico and all these, you know, all these barriers to people seeking asylum on the US-Mexico border. And he's directing Department of Homeland Security to make exceptions for Ukrainians that are coming at the Mexican border even, you know, to accommodate the promise that he's made to them. So it is kind of astounding. I mean, we at Human Rights Watch, you know, we're not just a refugee organization, we're a human rights organization and an IHL organization as well. And so we have people on the ground in Ukraine that are documenting IHL violations, human rights violations. We did a report recently on the filtration of people that have been unlawfully transferred into Russia. So these are, you know, some major human rights issues there that we're heavily engaged in. But on the refugee front, and as the director of our refugee division, for the most part, I deployed myself at the height of this crisis. I went to Turkey to document the pushbacks from Greece and Bulgaria and what's Turkey doing on the Iranian border and on the Syrian border. And I was there basically a lot of the time that you were in Moldova, I was in Turkey. And I remember at one point I'm in Turkey and I'm dealing with the interviews, these brutal pushbacks from Greece where they're stripping people of their clothing, they're throwing them, they're dumping them into the Evros River in December, you know, and just horribly mistreating people. And UNHCR, God bless your organization, you know, is doing a big benefit concert for Ukrainian refugee children in Athens, you know, and everybody's coming forward and, you know, all the, you know, it's just, the contrast for me was just one of these sort of, you know, mind-boggling, just absolutely mind-boggling contrasts. And so why and how? These are the things I've been really wrestling with. And, you know, I'd have to put, you know, as Alicia's talking about discrimination, I mean, flat out on the table, you know, racial, solidarity, discrimination, the treatment of the African and people of color that were coming out of Ukraine that were stopped at the border while the border was open to white, presumably Ukrainian because they're white, you know, and the racism was evident from the very beginning of the conflict, and I think has been evident throughout. And part of that is a very sort of, I don't know if you call it normal solidarity that people have had with refugees from time immemorial to have a kind of a solidarity with people that look like them and speak their language or have the same religion and not seen as other. But I think we have to be absolutely aware that there's a completely unjustified discrimination that's based on that solidarity. So you can only take the positive side of that so far when you're showing the back of the hand to the welcoming hand and pushing other people back. That said, I wanted to dig deeper into this, you know, where the differences are. And I think there are some differences that are not as easily attributable to race and religion and cultural affinity. One of the, and there are 5 that I would put on the table. One is that this is a kind of a throwback to the Cold War. It's foreign aggression. So that you had the Russian invasion of Poland. For Europeans in particular, it brings back, you know, an entire history of the way that European countries invaded each other for centuries, basically. And this alarm, a different kind of alarm went off. And it is in contrast to the Afghan and the Syrian and these other crises. What we've largely been dealing with in the post-Cold War period has been internal conflicts, civil conflicts, you know, with a lot of foreign interference, of course, no question about it. But basically, it is the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they are the ones that are still in power today. It is Assad and opposition to Assad in Syria, and he's still in power today. Even when the bullets stop flying in these places, you have a civil conflict with the persecutors, you know, in the driver's seat, and you don't have this Cold War model. You don't have foreign aggression in that manner. So that would be point number 1. Point number 2 is, and this is somewhat perception rather than reality. The perception is that these are people coming directly from the country of origin, directly into Poland, for example. And they're not fleeing through Turkey, which is where I was. So in Turkey, you're having people that are trying to get to the European Union. Many of them are seeing that as a transit country, as they're seeing Moldova. And so the response of Greece and Germany and other countries is, well, you're not fleeing directly from your home country to us. There's some safe third country in between. It may not be so safe. That's another issue, another question. And I mean, the thing to bear in mind, I said it's perception, 85% plus of the world's refugees do stay close to home. They are in countries of first arrival. And in the case of the Ukrainians, many of them are exactly just transiting through Moldova and going on to other countries in the European Union. So there's a perception there. I don't know that it actually matches the reality, but it's a strong perception that, and closely related to that, the third point I would make is that prior to the invasion, prior to the war, Ukrainians had visa-free travel to the European Union. And so the notion of illegality, I mean, and we can talk about visa regimes and how discriminatory they are on their face, but they don't, there's no accusation, there's no stigma of crossing borders illegally, of being, of in the hands of criminals, of the criminality, of you're breaking the law, you're jumping the queue, you're all these kinds of notions that are thrown at other refugee groups where people don't have visas and they're not able to get visas, they don't have documents. And so they're pushed back and they're thrown into detention because, supposedly they're illegal. And the notion of illegality is a stigma that attaches to many of these people. The fourth point is the notion, and that it may change over time, the notion that there's no mixed motivation here, that these are purely sort of war refugees, they're fleeing persecution, they're fleeing war, they don't have an economic motive. And again, there may be more perception than reality to that in some cases, but it's generally the case. And the problem with that, when I work particularly with Afghan refugees, is, yeah, I mean, Afghan refugees, their country is just completely incapacitated economically for all kinds of reasons having to do with the international banking system and sanctions and the environmental degradation and 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades of war and conflict. So yeah, they are at once, yes, economic migrants, but yes, they're also refugees. They're people that are fleeing persecution. They're people that are fleeing conflict. And the fact that you also have an economic motive doesn't forfeit your claim to being a refugee. And I would actually argue that in many cases, the threats, the existential threats based on climate change and based on these other factors is such that the 1951 convention is actually anachronistic in many respects by focusing on a persecution standard, and that we should be looking at the ICCPR, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, Article 6, Article 9 on rights to life, on security of person, and to have a more a protection regime that actually is consistent with what we're seeing out there in terms of the threats to people's lives and physical well-being. And Finally, I would say that the prospect of repatriation makes reception that much easier. Alice spoke about family separation. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Ukrainian government itself prevents men from the ages of 18 to 60 to leave the country, which means that it's women and children that are leaving the country. Overwhelmingly, we're seeing just the opposite with Syrian and Afghan refugees. It's overwhelmingly single men, meaning they're traveling without their families. They may have families back in Afghanistan. And so there is this bias, if you will, in helping women and children, a bias, if you will, against single men. They're more brutalized at borders, for example. There are more of them, of course, as well. But what that also means is that when those families reunite, they are more likely to those women and children are more likely to go back to join with their husbands. They're also, I think, in the case of Ukraine, there is a very strong national identity. And one of the things, like as I mentioned, in the case of Syrians, you have Assad, he's still in power. In the case of Afghanistan, you have the Taliban, they're in power. And so people that are on the outs with those that are in power are not going to come back to those countries. Whereas in the case of Ukraine, the government is in solidarity with the refugees. And the Russians don't look as though they're going to be occupying the entire country, and maybe even less and less. And so you do have a country to come back to, and you have a government that's supportive of you, that wants you to come back, and you have a strong national identity as well. So I think when you put those factors together, it is a different situation. I think we can look at it sort of objectively speaking and say, okay, there are some real differences here, but that's not to let Europeans or North Americans or others off the hook in any means, because the treatment of Afghans, of Syrians, of Central Americans, Venezuelans, Haitians, is the Somalis, I could go on and on and on, is so much worse than anything that we're seeing towards the Ukrainians. And again, I'm not saying to treat the Ukrainians any worse. This is the model, hopefully, for treating other groups better. We're not seeing much evidence of that. We're not seeing a coattail effect, if you will. But as advocates, I think that's what we need to be pushing.
Thank you so much. And, it's so interesting one of the things that I really love about this panel is that you've all been there, you've seen this firsthand. And we wanted to connect Olena Mikhalchenko from the Ukraine because she's not only seeing this as an expert, on human rights and international law, but she is living this as a person, right? And her family is also in the Ukraine. She's actually connecting from the Ukraine. So it will be great, Olena, if you share with us your personal experiences. What do you think about this refugee crisis and also the internal displacement crisis? Where do you think this is heading? Challenges? And thank you so much for connecting from the Ukraine today.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me and see me well?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me over Zoom today. And I'm really honored to be here with you. Yes, I'm currently connecting from my hometown, Kiev. I have been recently reunited with my family, and my family was actually among internal displaced people for several months, and they decided to come back home a few weeks ago, despite the ongoing war. And I can say that from my personal experience, a lot of people that went to Europe or to other countries, a lot of them are coming back, actually. And before I jump into the answer, I just wanted to thank Bill for explaining why the response to Ukraine was quite unique. And I just wanted to add to this that really for many different factors, the response to this crisis was a bit different than to others. Wanted just to mention also that, first of all, the territorial proximity made a lot of Ukrainians having different friends in Europe or relatives. And that's also helped a lot in the initial phases of the war, where those friends or relatives could host our people, or friends of friends, or I have many different stories where people were connecting with each other and helping each other out with housing or other things. Also, I wanted to mention important thing as to we cannot really say about Ukrainians as of refugees because many Ukrainians that fled to Europe, they applied for the temporary protection status, which was applied by the EU with a specific directive. So this directive is a little bit provides different process from the asylum seekers, and this is also important point because this is just a temporary status, and it indeed provides a little bit more speedy procedures for access to accommodation, healthcare, or a right to employment, but it also has a temporary nature, and that's why when the war is going to end, hopefully a lot of people will come back, because there's really a home here for many of Ukrainians, and I hear this all the time when I talk to my friends. I wanted to talk a little bit about the response from the international community. Well, when I think about it, I ask myself whether there was a response, and the answer, of course, yes. And whether it was effective to stop the war, I would say no. And do I think it could be more effective? And the answer is yes again. So on the economic side, I wanted just to provide one figure that speaks really for itself. Ukraine's economic losses from the Russian war reached 600 billion, and the economy currently cannot function properly. And while Ukraine receives aid from other countries since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has made 158 billion euros from its exports of oil and gas, with European Union as the main customer. We call among ourselves Russia, we call a gas station state. It's because almost 40% of state revenue in Russia comes from oil and gas. And unfortunately, in the past 20 years, Europe became very dependent on this Russian gas and oil. And so dependent that by 2021, Europe couldn't get through even a winter without Russian gas. And knowing this, Putin already had enough confidence to invade Ukraine. And in addition to Russia's annexation of Ukrainian Peninsula, Crimea, and occupation of eastern regions by Russia in 2014, haven't had an effective response from the international community back then. And in my view, this was also a signal for Putin that he can get away with further invading Ukraine. And that's why answering your question about the response, I will say that Ukraine definitely needs more sanctions on Russia and more weapons, because the faster this happens, the faster the war can end and people can get to normal life, come back home without war. And in my opinion, this should be the primarily focus. This war already lasts very long. I remember when it just started, I couldn't believe that this could last so long. I thought that just a matter of couple of weeks is just temporary. My mother and my grandmother, who is 94-year-old, when they were flooding Kiev, they took just a few things with them. They thought that they're just going for a few weeks, but they had to stay from their home for about 5 months. And despite the still many risks that now exist in Ukraine, they still thought that it's better for them to come back, because it's really hard for people in who are not young to integrate in a country who they don't speak the language, they don't have jobs there. So that's why I just wanted to reiterate that this has been really devastating, and I hope that the war could end really fast.
Olena, thank you so much for sharing not only your expert, thoughts on this, right, from an international affairs standpoint, but also for sharing your personal experience. Maybe we'll echo what you just said. We really have this high hope that this war will end soon, and you have all of our solidarity and all of our support.
Thank you.
I want to pass now, the floor to Professor Calabro, who's going to give us some commentary on what has been discussed so far.
So first, I just want to echo Gloria and a huge thank you to all of our speakers. I feel honestly very honored to have you all here and to be sitting up here next to such experts in the field. So I'm just briefly going to kind of reiterate some of the main points that were discussed by the speakers. So first off, I think I really want to drive home the fact that this has revealed a massive double standard. I think that each of our speakers has kind of alluded to that or said it outright, and I think that I completely agree that this needs to be the model moving forward. I think it's great that this is the response that we have seen to this crisis, but if we can copy this and attribute it to other crises, that would be incredible. And also just going off of something that Olena just mentioned, the 2001 directive that the EU put in place to help out Ukrainian refugees, to make that temporary protected status more accessible and to allow those people to more quickly be integrated into the society and have access to schools, to jobs, to housing. That was not utilized in previous crises. So that's another example of how the Ukrainian refugee crisis has amplified that double standard. Furthermore, I think that the comment that Alice made about the winterization and the shelter epidemic that's going to be coming up, I think that that's a real concern and kind of relates to Olena's hope that this is going to end, and all of our hope that this war is going to end quickly, because there are these issues that are about to come up in the winter months, and when we are approaching a year of this war, which is insane, that I think we really need to hope that this war comes to an end quickly rather than prolonging it. Yeah, I think that just overall the conversation that the speakers have had and their expertise that they've offered on this subject matter has been really, really insightful. And I want to thank you all again so much for coming. And thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Calabro. And I actually want to finish this part just letting and giving the speakers just a few minutes to say anything else that you want to share about this particular situation and how you think this crisis will change, maybe the response, to refugee crisis in the future, and any impact that you think it will have on international law in this area in general. Okay.
Sure, I can start. I think there's some really interesting legal issues that this crisis brings up. The first refers to something Bill had mentioned about, and I'd also mentioned about men being held back from leaving Ukraine. To be clear, these are not men who are currently in military service. This is men of any age, of any military status, but men between the ages of 18 and 60. There is a fundamental right to seek asylum, and that's not being upheld in that way. So that is an interesting dynamic that needs to be explored a little, and is a critique, I think, of the Ukrainian government. What was the first interesting point? I think the second interesting point of law that's going to come up, and Olena referred to this a bit, the temporary protection is in place now. It's not going to be in place for people in a year and 2 years. And what becomes interesting in the cycles of displacement is when people start to build lives in the country of refuge, and then their status runs out. There are questions in both Europe, in the European Union, in Moldova, here in the United States. What is it that those people will have access to? If they choose to then apply for asylum instead of returning to Ukraine, we then have a question, we circle back into one of the big questions of refugee law and policy right now, which is, what is a refugee? I think the Ukrainian crisis is in people's minds because it's a foreign aggression, because it's easy for people to say, oh, those people are refugees. But are they under the definition? There's a nexus problem for those of you who have been in asylum clinics or that kind of thing. Like, the United States doesn't cover generalized violence in its refugee definition. Like, we're going to have some interesting questions there. And then we've got some much bigger picture questions about what is the right definition of a refugee in the modern world. Bill mentioned the ICCPR, the right to life. There are some really fundamental questions about why we see the Ukrainians right now as fundamentally refugees and other populations as not. So I think there's some super interesting legal questions. I encourage you guys to delve into refugee law. I love it.
That's a really good message.
Thank you. So if I could just mention some unique legal issues that we at Human Rights First in particular have had to work through since this refugee crisis began. One of the things was we were anticipating an influx of Ukrainian asylum seekers right away or soon thereafter. Just by means of background, our organization provides direct representation to asylum seekers who are here in the US. So we provide that free, it's free pro bono, no charge, and we pair with multiple law firms and lawyers around the country. We partner with them who and provide mentoring to those law firms for those law firms to give the legal representation to our clients and work hand in hand. And that way we can expand our footprint. So we're very well ingrained in the asylum representation space. We at Human Rights First, we have not seen an influx of Ukrainian asylum seekers for the reasons why you've heard today, in that the response, not just in the United States, but worldwide, has been so overwhelmingly supportive of Ukrainian refugees. In particular with the US, there's the temporary protection status that the Ukrainians have who already were here, and they can remain here for 18 months at a time. The status may be renewed by the president after 18 months. So they don't need to seek asylum. They can if they want, but they don't need to. The TPS status is more streamlined. As you heard from Olena, Ukrainians, if they fled their country, they want to return. They're not trying to stay in a third-party country. They'd rather be at home. So seeking asylum is a more permanent solution. So the TPS status, it's temporary. It gives them, similar protections, allows them to work, allows them to legally be here. So we've seen Ukrainians who are here in the US seeking that approach and going down that path. We've also seen humanitarian parole. Those are for Ukrainians who are overseas and want to want to come to the US temporarily. Perhaps they have family members here. And so it's a streamlined process to get them here. Again, that's I believe, a 2-year protection, could be renewed by the federal government. Again, it's not asylum per se. So we haven't seen the influx of asylum seekers, but we may. It depends upon how long this war lasts. And we all are crossing our fingers and hoping that it is done soon as possible. But we don't know how the tables will turn, and we don't know what will happen. We don't know what winter will bring, of course. And so if TPS runs out, if humanitarian parole runs out, we may at that point see, at least at Human Rights First, an influx of Ukrainian asylum seekers. We have seen an uptick of Russian asylum seekers, which has been interesting. Keep in mind, dissidents from Russia, they may flee their country too, and they need a place to go. And that brings me, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the situation of our senior advisor, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a Human Rights First employee, a consultant. He is a US green card holder, a Russian national who was poisoned twice by Putin. He fled Russia, was living in the Washington, D.C. area, and has been very prominent in speaking out against the Russian government. When the war started in February, he returned to Russia because he felt that he could make the most impact in Russia as a Russian citizen, particularly a former Russian politician, speaking out against the war in Ukraine, speaking out against what Putin is doing. He was arrested in April by the Russian police forces and has been held in detention since that time. The trial date has been bumped and bumped and bumped. And we have had the strong support of congressmen and also of the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in demanding and advocating for Kara-Murza's release. We wish him safety, and we wish the best for his family, who is here in Washington, D.C. So that's an interesting legal issue that we at Human Rights First have had to work with and work around and message to the public. How do we get the message out as to what's happening to dissidents in Russia? One other thing that, another legal issue that we in particular have had to work through was we wanted to do more than refugee representation. And so when this war started, we collaborated internally together and with a third-party company, and we devised a Ukrainian messaging campaign where through a intermediary based in Ukraine, a tech company, we blasted messages to Russian language setting cell phones in Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine, advising in Russian and the Ukrainian language that if you are Russian and if you are there to commit violence, that you potentially could be committing a war crime, and it could potentially be prosecutable by an international body. This was an absolute creative thing that we did. We really wanted to put our heads together to see how we can get messaging directly to the troops on the ground, the Russian troops, who you've seen the news reports. There's been a lack of communication to the Russian troops. There's been a lot of disillusion among particularly the rank and file. They're not getting information. It's a black hole in a sense as to the type of information they're getting and the real story as to what is happening in Ukraine. Many of them didn't even know why they were there. And if they knew why they were there, they were told misinformation by the Russian government. So we wanted to get information directly to them to see if that moved the needle at all. It's hard to tell if that moves the needle, but we've been very gratified that our messaging campaign has reached over 900,000 cell phone devices so far in Eastern and Southern Ukraine. So this is totally something new that HRF has done. We've never done something like this before. I don't know if we ever will, but we wanted to respond to the moment. And then just lastly, in terms of necessary advancements in refugee protection, Bill mentioned Remain in Mexico and Title 42. These are US laws and regulations that essentially prevent, they were started under the prior presidential administration, the Trump administration, and essentially prevent asylum seekers from asserting their lawful right to seek asylum. Remain in Mexico forces asylum seekers and other immigrants attempting to cross the southern border to wait on the Mexico side in encampments that are dangerous. The people waiting there are prey to gangs and to violence, including sexual violence. Title 42 is supposedly a public health measure, but actually in reality does nothing to protect the public. It prevents, again, asylum seekers from entering the United States to seek asylum on the grounds that they might be carrying the coronavirus. However, there's so many exceptions to the number of people, immigrants who can come in, that it's really quite ineffective. And Ukrainians, have, because of the positive response that the US government has had to the Ukrainian refugees, Ukrainians have been allowed to enter despite Title 42 and despite Remain in Mexico, whereas other migrants have not. There's just, it's really inexplicable as to why that is happening, other than this underlying, strain of discrimination against people of color and other migrants apart from Ukrainians. Again, we absolutely applaud the efforts towards Ukrainians, and that should be the model, and that's what we want to strive to. So those are some of the necessary changes that human rights organizations like HRF have been advocating to change, get rid of Remain in Mexico. I know the Biden administration is trying to wind it down. The Supreme Court finally, in the last 2 months, has allowed the Biden administration to wind it down. There is an amended complaint that was filed in Texas seeking a stay of that. We'll see what happens. And then Title 42, that unfortunately is still in place. So there's a lot of work to be done, but the worldwide response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis, there's some amazing positive things to take from it. And hopefully, as we deconstruct and talk more about this over the next months and years, we can take those positive things from the worldwide response and the United States response and use that going forward for other refugee crises.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I completely agree with everything that the two of you were saying, and the challenges to refugee law. The thing I would add is sort of a new wrinkle for a law school audience to think about is the international humanitarian law. So we deal with human rights law, we deal with refugee law, and that's kind of like our bread and butter. This has really been we've really forced us to take deep dives into a lot of IHL questions. We just did a 71-page report, the title of which is "We Had No Choice: Filtration and the Crime of Forcibly Transferring Ukrainian Civilians to Russia," where we're trying to do what UNHCR is saying, you've got this black hole, you count in your numbers of refugees, 2.5 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Russia, and yet some of them are voluntarily, some of them, including some of the 18 to 60-year-old men, that the only way they can get out is via Russia, ironically. But we have been able, and despite the Russians closing down our office in Moscow and decertifying us as a legal organization functioning in the country, we're just challenges to our methodology, but also to sort of legal framing of these questions of what are the IHL the laws of war on evacuations, which is complex because evacuations are allowed in some cases. What is the crime of deportation? In refugee law, that's deportations are legal, and now IHL, it's actually a crime for the statute of the International Criminal Court is the crime of deportation. So we have to sort of, even using some of the same language, the same nomenclature, we're having to really wrestle with it. And I guess just as a little example, if I could, of a personal example of how I had to really wrestle with this. So I did a report back in 2010 on migrant detention centers in Ukraine. And I was in all the migrant detention centers and and did this report, and they, again, some really horrible treatment of third country nationals, of migrants by the Ukrainians in Ukraine. And when the war broke out, there were these same detention centers that I had been in were, had people that were detained in them, that were in administrative detention for the purposes of removing them to their home countries. Well, the war breaks out, you can no longer effectuate these removals, so there's no legitimate reason anymore to maintain detention. So it's arbitrary detention, they need to be released. But in addition to that, what we discovered, because we were able to communicate, we had lines of communication with the detainees inside these detention centers remotely, and they were smuggling out in the Zhorovichi Center, they smuggled out to us video showing it was a former military barracks, and the Ukrainians were actually, I don't know if I should be saying this, how publicly this is, but they were deploying their troops in, quartering them in this detention center. And we were seeing like military hardware and troops that were going in. And so we were really, usually we do press releases, but in this case, we would be, the IHL violation of human shielding, we would actually be potentially identifying this as a legitimate military target for which, incidental civilian casualties are permissible under international humanitarian law. And so, we had to approach the Ukrainians privately on this and not go public with that information. And then we had in the Mykolaiv Center is right close to the front lines. And the detainees that were there were telling us that they were hearing shelling coming. And we had, again, private interventions. We ended up going to the European Court of Human Rights and got what's the Rule 39. It's for those of you not familiar with it, it's kind of like an injunction basically on human rights grounds for human rights violations. And we got two Rule 39 orders to Ukraine to release people from these detention centers. Anyway, the good news at the end of the day is through those private interventions, through Rule 39, all of the people that we identified have been released. We've tracked them. They've actually, most of them are in Germany now. So happy ending. But this is the kind of thing that, we're really, really struggling with. Amnesty had egg on its face on some similar kinds of issues of how to deal with IHL problems and what to do publicly and what to do privately. And it's really challenges to methodology, to advocacy, to legal framing. But it's for law students, this is really, there's a lot of really interesting stuff to dig into here. And how we even characterize the Ukrainians that are in Russia, and how we approach that issue. 2.5 million people, that's a biggie, and very little. We're an NGO. We try to do what we can, but what is an intergovernmental organization where Russia sits on the Security Council? What do you say in those circumstances? So it's. UNHCR's hands are tied in many respects, and we have a lot of limitations to what we can do. But while we're praising the European Union for temporary protection and work authorization and free movement, there could be real. What happens in these filtration centers? What happens to the people who don't pass the test? We don't know about that. All we've talked about are people that went through the filtration centers, got to Estonia or Latvia, where we had people, we could interview them about what they experienced. We don't know what happened to people who went into the filtration centers and basically never came out. So there's human rights IHL investigations that are ongoing that we're engaged in, but it's very, very challenging, and it's a really interesting area of international law.
Thank you. Olena, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share?
Sure. Well, first of all, I wanted to share something that my friend told me just about a month after the war started, when the things stopped being that well, actually, yeah, just like a month passed when she told me that, before the war, we really had it all, but we didn't know until Russia came and destroyed it. And I feel like this is something that a lot of people feel in Ukraine, that, you know, it's a beautiful country. There's a lot of opportunities to grow, and there's a lot of creative people, great places, great history. And I really love that after the war, we'll have a lot of tourists coming in. But just coming back to the story, I just wanted to point out that when the war started, nobody really could believe that this is really happening, because it started at 4 a.m. on February 24th. Many cities have been bombed. This created a very, very dramatic situation. No one knew what's going to happen next minute and what is the right thing to do. I personally was deciding, like, with my family, should my family evacuate or not, whether it's a good decision or not, because immediately after the war started, there was just 100 kilometers traffic jams in all over Ukraine, because people tried to escape the cities that were bombed. And for instance, if it takes from Kiev to drive to Lviv, which is on the west, close to the Polish border, it takes about 7 hours to drive. People were spending days in the cars to get there, because our roads are pretty small and they couldn't hold all these people that were trying to evacuate. And I just wanted you to think about Ukraine. That is a really big country. It is larger than any of the European countries, such as France, Spain, or Germany. It has a population of 44 million people. And therefore, when Russia started this war, 1/3 of Ukrainians, or even more, they have been forced from their homes. And this has been the largest human displacement crisis in the world today. And just wanted to reiterate that this crisis cannot be considered in the vacuum, because if there's no war, there's no crisis. And by crisis, I think about all this 15 million people who had to run from a war, relocate and start over, or hold off if there's a place even to come back, because a lot of infrastructure, a lot of residential buildings have been destroyed. And therefore, the longer this war continues, the longer the crisis lasts, and the longer it will take for these people to rebuild their life. But most importantly, unfortunately, if it continues, the more people die, and from both sides every day. So I really hope that the international community and every person can do as much as they can to stop this war. Thank you so much.
Elena, thank you so much, and we stand by you. I want you to know that we're here and we have the same hopes, and a lot of what we're doing with these panels is also spreading knowledge and information that can be really useful, you know, to address this kind of really difficult situation. And I want to thank our panelists, not only for your time, but your insight, for your wisdom, for your experiences. You know, it's absolutely wonderful to have you here. And I think we have time for like 2 questions from the audience. So Allison, please.
Yes. I'm Alison Anthony. I'm South African, visiting here at GW. Thank you so much for the seminar. I just wanted to say thank you that we are able to talk about this, because this is not a common thing around the world. A lot of the time, with great respect to what the Ukrainian people are going through, the white elephant doesn't get named. So thank you so much that we're able to talk about it openly, as experts, as educated people. But moving on from identifying the problem, what can we do? What can we do about it? Because yes, we are lawyers, and yes, we can change the law, but the wheels of change go very slowly. Yes, we can change refugee law, we can change IHL law. It's going to take the next 5 to 10 years before that gets done. And it's just, I myself experience visa discrimination every time I leave my country. I'm experiencing it right now at the moment. I don't have my passport with me at the moment because of it. But I mean, I have a friend who's an Afghan who called me on Monday and said he just heard that his cousin was killed in a suicide attack in Kabul. And he has been struggling for years to get his sister, 5 years old. And it's just, she's not being helped the way Ukrainian refugees are. And I'm just, you know, is it not time that we do something that can be done now, because these people do not need help 5 years from now when the law changes. They needed our help 20 years ago. You know, and I'm sorry I get emotional about it because I'm much closer to it, and I think that's one of the reasons why things change so slowly, because of hierarchy, bureaucracy, red tape, and all of that, but because those people are not as close to it. So it's something you read in the news because you only see the plight of Afghan kids and Syrians and everybody else on Al Jazeera. It's not on CNN. It's not on ABC News. You know, it's not on BBC. The media has a role to play here as well. And as advocates, we have a role to play too, and as educated people too. Because it's heartbreaking to see.
Maybe I can.
And it's just what can we do now? You know, is there something that a program, an international program, I'm sorry, an international program that, you know, is like funded by the World Bank, for example, that says that this is how we deal with refugees throughout the world. Isn't it time that we start limiting state sovereignty? You know, for exceptional cases like refugees, because it is a pandemic in and of itself. You know, yes, there is state sovereignty. We cannot get involved in how other countries arrange their laws and things like that. But isn't there something that can be done? That's every right, no right in the world is absolute. Everything is. So isn't state sovereignty something we can look at as advocates, as legal professionals, to also limit that and say these are the exceptions coming from a UN perspective, coming from a UN, from a World Bank perspective, and provide the funding for this is the policy we're going to work according to for out the world, irrespective of color, creed, religion, heritage, whatever. This is how, and you governments, you do not have much of a choice because this is how we're limiting state sovereignty, because it's justifiable based on international humanitarian.
So I think
it's just an idea. I don't know.
I think that one of the things you can do now, and this I think is like a continued debate, a personal debate for any of us over the scope of our careers, is do you do global policy work or do you do direct service work? I think we are all so privileged to get to work at both ends of those scales. Some of the people that I interviewed when I was with Human Rights Watch are some of the most powerful work you get to do because you are directly talking and learning from people's experience. I interviewed a lot of unaccompanied refugee kids, and like, God, being able to give voice to a 15-year-old is a pretty empowering thing for me as an advocate. So I think right now what you can do is perhaps take on individual cases and push and figure out and try and find every possible avenue. It is horrific, the global system that we have. There's no question about that. I think 5 years is a really short time window that we're looking at for that change. Like, you know, so, like, love your optimism on the 5 years. It's not going to happen. So I think to sustain trying to make the big picture change you're talking about, which is at some level deeply necessary, we need to find ways that throughout our careers, we're constantly connecting to the people that it has the most impact on.
300%.
Yes, completely, 100%. I would also just add one thing. Let's also not forget, for those of you who can vote here in the U.S., and I don't mean to sound trite by saying vote, but please vote and know what you're voting for, know who you're voting for. A lot of the anti-immigrant language is being led at the state level, certain states along the border, by politicians who, you know, have really tapped into something extreme in the local population, an anti-immigrant threat that's in the local population, and are really, really exploiting it. And this has always happened, right? But social media amplifies it even more so than it could have 20 years ago. And so a lot of, like, I've mentioned Remain in Mexico policy or Title 42, those challenges to President Biden's administration to wind down those anti-immigrant policies have all come from state AGs at the local level, such as Texas and Missouri and Louisiana and some of these other key states, challenging federal immigration policy, which is just like backwards and bizarre. And there's real constitutional issues to that, but they have found sympathetic ears to certain district court judges and circuit courts. And so know who you're voting for when you go into the ballot box, because the state elections really matter, because it's these state AGs who are leading the charge to prevent the current presidential administration from better equalizing immigration policy. So I would just add that piece, but I agree with everything that Alice said.
One tiny other piece I would mention is engagement with refugee resettlement, that you're on the local level through your faith-based group, community groups, whatever, student groups, you name it. I mean, you can figure out ways to work in bringing refugees into your home, and you can do it. And there are a lot of opportunities in the DC area to work hands-on with refugees, helping them, working with them, assisting them, and it's Syrians, it's Ukrainians, it's Afghans, it's Congolese. So it's really something that I think, one, it's a direct engagement in the sense that lawyers have the opportunity as well to help people with asylum claims, but it's something that anyone can do. But I also think in terms of building that sort of that organic kind of support for refugees that you need at the local level to build up to really change these policies, which are not going to change necessarily within that 5-year time frame, getting the engagement of people that identify, that understand who refugees are, because these are people that they actually know and they've broken bread with, and they've seen do amazing things, because these are really resilient, amazing people. And when you get to actually know refugees that are here in the United States, they're real people, and they're just like you or me. I know, it sounds trite, but when you're really there, it makes all the difference in the world. And it's people in Kansas that can do this. And Utah has been one of the really welcoming states. It's a red Republican, very conservative state. It's been very welcoming to refugees. Why? Because they see it as part of their religious tradition, but in addition to that, actually involvement with refugee resettlement.
Pressure on governments to do it faster.
And Alison, the law is such a powerful tool. Like I'm always telling students, that when you're in law school, you're in this pressure cooker that you're not necessarily in touch with the power of the law. And then when you start working, I've been very honored to be able to litigate numerous human rights cases, right? And you start seeing what you can do just because you have a basic understanding of the law. It's incredible how many people you can help in so many capacities. And a lot of it is finding your entry point where you think you can be a better contributor, right? That could be through advocacy, that can be through case litigation, that could be, through doing more direct service work, right? A lot of it is finding what you want to work on, where you think your entry points are. But many of us in this room have so many tools. And this is what I always tell students, there's a lot that you can do with what we're doing, at the law school level, even though we know it's a very complex setting.
It's a multi-layered problem.
Yeah, exactly. Any other questions in the room? Any final words, Olena? Is she still with us? Oh, she had to leave? Any final words, Professor Calabro?
Thank you all again so much. Thank you to our panelists. This was really incredible.
Thank you for the answers. I'm sorry for getting emotional.
Oh,
beautiful week. It was just like cherry on the cake.
Alison, passion is good. It is the, it always is. You just channel it for something, for something good, right? I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank all of our panelists. This was so tremendous. And I want to thank you also for your work. Because you're working with such difficult circumstances and in such difficult conditions. And it's amazing. I really stand in admiration, for everything that you do on a daily basis. Thank you so much, Professor Calabro, again, for putting together this event. And thank you to our co-sponsors. And I also want to leave you with a message of peace. Okay, this is what we want. We want peace with a hope, that this war ends soon, and with solidarity for all of those that are affected by this armed conflict and crisis. Okay? Have a good rest of your day, and thank you so much for everyone for being here.
Yeah.
Parts of the wrong spot, so. Part here, which I don't think that is. Let's see, yeah.
Just recycled them.
One of our wonderful things.
You want to get more food.
We filed an amicus of the Supreme Court.
We're still not stuck here.
Maybe getting a new.
It just comes to you. Oh, yeah, you guys.